Chapter 1. The Missing Phone. Claire's hand trembled as she touched her swollen cheek, the sting of Steve's slap still fresh. Her new phone was lost, and she knew there was no hope of getting another one. Steve's response had been as predictable as always, an explosion of rage followed by a hard, unforgiving blow. His footsteps echoed in the house as he paced behind her, his anger bubbling to the surface.
You think I'm made of money?
Steve barked, glaring at her.
You lost it, so you're not getting another one. Understand?
Claire nodded, her lip trembling. She had learned over the years to keep quiet, to not provoke him any further. One wrong word could lead to a worse punishment. She watched as Steve finally stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, leaving her in silence. The next morning, the air in the house felt heavier, as if the walls were closing in on her. Steve had gone to work, and Claire sat in the kitchen, her mind racing. Her jaw ached from where his hand had struck her. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the suffocating hopelessness she felt. She glanced over at the jewelry box on the dresser, one of the few things she had that he hadn't taken from her. Opening it, she ran her fingers over the small collection of gold and silver, reminders of a time when life wasn't so dark.
Why do I endure this madness?
She whispered to herself as she slid open the top drawer of the dresser. Her hand reached deep into the shadows at the back, closing around Steve's prized Glock. Chapter 2. Vanishing Act. When Steve returned home that evening, the house was empty. At first, he didn't think much of it. Claire had probably gone out for some air, maybe to blow off steam after their argument. But as the hours passed and her absence stretched on, frustration turned into panic. He called her phone repeatedly, each call going unanswered. The memory of the slap lingered in his mind, but it didn't matter now. Where was she? He tore through the house, opening every door, searching each room as if she might be hiding somewhere. Nothing. Claire had vanished without a trace. Frustrated and growing more anxious by the minute, Steve got into his car and drove to the police station. The tired officer at the desk barely looked up when Steve slammed his fists on the counter.
My wife is missing,
Steve barked.
I've been trying to call her all day. She didn't take anything with her. She's just gone.
How long has she been missing?
The officer asked lazily, scribbling on a notepad.
Only a few hours, but I know something's wrong. She wouldn't just leave like this.
The officer sighed, clearly unimpressed.
Sir, we suggest waiting at least 72 hours before filing a missing persons report. Chances are she'll come back on her own.
Steve clenched his fists.
She said she lost her phone. If she wasn't lying to me, she probably won't be able to call me.
The officer barely blinked.
We'll make a note of it, but for now, go home and wait.
Back at the house, Steve's unease grew into full-blown paranoia. Something wasn't right. Claire wouldn't just disappear. As he wandered into their bedroom, he noticed something strange. The jewelry box on her dresser was open. Claire never left it open. Curious, he stepped closer and saw a small folded note tucked inside. Lunch soon, I'll be waiting, Mark. Steve's blood ran cold. Mark, their next-door neighbor, had always seemed friendly. Too friendly. Now, everything felt suspicious. His waves across the fence, the polite small talk, the way he always seemed to linger around. It all felt like part of a larger plan. Without another thought, Steve stormed back to the police station, clutching the note as if it were evidence.
It's the neighbor.
He growled at the officer.
Mark, he's the one. You need to question him, right fucking now.
The officer glanced at the note, unimpressed.
A lunch invitation isn't evidence, sir. You need to wait. Let's see if your wife comes home on her own.
Mark stormed off in frustration, muttering under his breath.
I suppose I'll have to handle this on my own.
I wouldn't do that if I were you.
The officer called out, his voice cutting through the room as Mark stepped out of the building.
Go fuck yourself, you useless pig.
Chapter 3. Spiraling. The next 2 days were a blur of rage and obsession. Claire was still missing, and Steve's suspicion of Mark consumed him. Every time Steve looked out the window, he saw Mark going about his day as if nothing was wrong. Watering his lawn, waving to neighbors, living a life of normalcy while Claire remained missing. Steve's blood boiled with every passing hour. On the 3rd day, he couldn't take it anymore. The pressure had built up inside him like a ticking time bomb, and when he saw Mark in his yard, Steve snapped. He grabbed his coat, shoved a gun into his pocket, and marched across the lawn, his fists clenched and eyes blazing with fury. Mark opened the door with a look of surprise.
Hey, Steve, what's up?
Where the fuck is my wife?
Steve roared, shoving him inside the house. Mark staggered back, holding up his hands.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But Steve didn't believe a word. The anger had taken over, clouding his judgment. Before he even realized what he was doing, he threw a punch, knocking Mark to the ground. Mark fought back, his fists flying in defense, but Steve's rage only grew. Without thinking, Steve pulled the gun from his pocket and fired. The deafening sound of the shot echoed through the house, and when the ringing in Steve's ears faded, he saw Mark lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Steve stood frozen in shock, the weight of what he'd just done crashing down on him. He had killed Mark. The reality of it suffocated him as he stumbled back to his house. Collapsing into his armchair, Steve's heart pounded as he replayed the scene over and over. He had ruined everything. Suddenly, headlights flashed across the window. Chapter 4. The Return. Claire stepped out of the taxi, her eyes scanning the dark, silent house. The stillness unnerved her. Steve was usually home by now. She paid the cab driver and took a deep breath before walking up the steps, feeling a pit form in her stomach. She opened the front door and called out into the darkness.
Honey, I'm home.
The silence was deafening. Claire's heart pounded as she took a few steps into the living room. The house felt different, like a storm waiting to break. That's when she heard his voice, low and menacing, cutting through the darkness like a blade.
Where the fuck have you been?
Claire jumped, startled. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light and she saw Steve sitting in the armchair, his silhouette barely visible. She tried to calm herself, forcing a smile.
I told you I was going to stay with Grandma for a few days while you cooled off.
You didn't tell me shit, you lying little bitch.
Steve growled, standing up. His anger was palpable, vibrating through the room.
I left you a note?
Claire said, confused, walking over to the fridge. Her hands shook as she reached down, noticing the note had fallen under the fridge. She picked it up and held it out.
See, here it is.
Steve's eyes darkened with fury.
Why didn't you just call?
Claire's nervous chuckle filled the room.
You know, I lost my phone, and Grandma doesn't have one either. It's not like
But Steve didn't let her finish. He lunged at her, slapping her hard.
You think I'm an idiot? You think I don't know what's going on between you and Mark?
Chapter 5. The Endgame. Claire's heart raced as Steve's hand struck her again. The sting of the blow, sharp and cruel. She stumbled backward, breaking free from his grip, and ran toward the front door. She couldn't stay there, not with him in this state. She threw the door open and bolted outside, her feet carrying her toward Mark's house before her mind could even register the danger.
help.
She screamed, pounding on Mark's door. But when the door swung open, Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Mark lay inside, sprawled on the floor in a pool of blood. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned back to Steve, who stood at the threshold, watching her with a cold, unreadable expression.
What have you done?
Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Sobbing, she stumbled into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. Steve pounded on the door from the outside, but Claire ignored him. Her eyes darted around the room until she spotted Mark's phone on a nearby table. With shaking hands, she dialed 911, her voice barely a whisper as she told the operator what had happened. The pounding stopped. Outside, Steve stood in the darkness, his fists unclenched, his body still. He turned slowly and walked back toward their house, sitting on the front porch, waiting. It wasn't long before the flashing lights of police cars filled the street. They came for Steve, cuffing him and leading him away without incident. Claire stood by, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling as the officers took him into custody. But once they were gone, the tears stopped. In the eerie silence of the night, Claire's expression shifted. Calmly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her lost phone. It had been there all along. Dialing a number, she waited for the call to connect. When it did, her voice was steady, free of emotion.
It's done.